In this tape, we'll look further at how you improve your writing, particularly looking at sentence connectors, and then in the second part, looking at different types of citations. So it's important to connect not just your paragraphs, as we talked with topic sentences, but within the paragraph, you use different types of connectors to connect the sentences. One is called continuity, then there are logical connectors, and also sequence connectors. These are three different ways of connecting sentences, probably the most important of various ways of connecting things. Continuity refers to just continuing the same topic, often by repetition of the same words or perhaps by same ideas with different synonyms or pronouns. So again, you use this in your work.
So by talking about using the Varbro program, I have to continue by saying Varbro is a computer program that such and such. They are connected. It's a continuation.
So the end of one sentence often connects to the beginning of the next by repeating the same words. Sometimes the beginning of one sentence will connect with the beginning of the next sentence. There are different ways that you can do this depending on your topic. But often you repeat the same keywords in two or three sentences in order to make sure they all connect well.
Or we say this program.
Right.
Yeah, to demonstrate using a demonstrative pronoun to refer to the same thing without repeating the whole thing.
Exactly, especially if you have a long name or something like that. The second way is using logical connectors, and there are many different types of logical connectors. You could say A and B, but you can also say furthermore, and that tends to emphasize B. It tends to emphasize the second of these things and say this is even more important. You can also contrast A and B by saying, however, A was true, however, there are problems. You can show result, things like therefore, or cause, which is sort of backwards result, because. You can talk about unexpected results or unexpected causes, nevertheless, or although. You can clarify by saying that is, or i.e. You can show examples, for example, for instance, e.g. I have more examples of this in the textbook, which you can look at for each of these different categories.
These inventories are very important so that we have several options to choose from without repeating the same thing again and again.
Right. And so again, in the supplemental material for the textbook is particularly written for ESL students to show them how these are used similarly or the different structure of sentences. So it's worthwhile taking a look at that if you have time.
Like for example, I use however, although, all these connectors to show the relationship between those sentences.
And again, these are used where you're showing the limitation of previous studies. They have done this, however, these factors cannot explain certain cases. They have done this, however, it has also been reported that the opposite may be true.
So the word however is very useful when you want to point out the research gap. Then you have to say, however, they have done so much, however, something has not been done.
And it's the same in engineering. However is the most important word in showing the limitations of previous solutions. So a very, very important word to make use of. And then again, in the discussion, this is an example from your article, and every sentence after the topic sentence has a logical connector of some sort.
Based on.
Hence, on the other hand, although, however, all of these logically connect one sentence with another in coming up with an explanation for your data.
Once again, it shows the importance of using logical connectors. In a short paragraph like that, how many connectors have I used?
Right. Again, almost every sentence. And so when you're dealing with an explanation, you're probably going to use logical connectors, cause, result, contrast. Whereas when you're dealing with some other parts of the paper, you may use continuity connectors more. So it depends on what your argument is in that particular paragraph, which of these connectors you're likely to use. You may also use sequence connectors. Sequence can be things like ordinal numbers, first, second, third. Those can be either a time sequence, we did this first, or it can be a list sequence where you're making certain points. You can also use other words like next, then, afterward, which specifically indicate time sequence. For instance, in a paper that I wrote, I emphasized 5 aspects that stand out as having a large effect. First, second, third, fourth, finally. And again, finally, instead of saying fifth, indicates this is the last, so that people know this is the end of this sequence. On another place, I used a time sequence. The method was proposed whereby students begin by doing one thing, then they do a second thing. And this is talking about the writing style, writing topic sentences. I would not have to put those in. I could simply put sentences without those. But by saying begin and then, it indicates that these are sequential. Okay, let's move on to the idea of citations and integral versus non-integral citations. The choice of using an integral versus a non-integral citation actually reflects your attitude toward that information. What is an integral citation versus a non-integral?
Integral citation, you begin with the authors. You want to foreground. You want to show this is very authoritative. You give it a very prominent position. At the beginning of the sentence, you foreground the authors.
So you're likely to do this when it's a very important author, someone that has contributed to the field. But it's also more common in social science than in engineering.
Because in social sciences and humanities, we have a lot of founding fathers and important authoritative figures, or our professors we wanted to cite and give our due respect for.
On the other hand, in science, we tend to use more non-integral citations. The ideas are more important, and who brought up those ideas are just put in parentheses as part of the citation.
You can see it occurs at the end of the sentence, so it shows it's an afterthought. It's not like integral citation. You begin with the sentence with the authoritative figure's statement.
Right. And in engineering, it's shoved even more into the background because you just use numbers. You can't even see the names with the non-integral citations.
So it shows your attitude so clearly.
Right. So again, the integral citations are used to describe the model, to describe key milestones, but they're relatively few in science and engineering. The first work in the field, the current model, that's about it. Whereas again, much more common in social science.
Yes.
And then quotes also would use integral citations.
Once again, this is my co-author Elaine Theron's decision to put Schmidt's work in direct quote like this. As a younger generation, my practice is already different from my teacher, like Elaine Theron, my mentor.
Yeah, and again, quotes are very common in social science, but almost never found in science and engineering. Now again, in iGEM, you have the science part, but you also have the human practices part. And so human practice is much more likely to have quotes from the people that they have talked to, rather than science will just summarize what someone suggested for the dry lab or wet lab.
And also, as a co-authored paper, we have to pay attention to each author's style and needs as we write this together.
And so again, the non-integral are the most common in science and engineering.
So once again, in my article, I also use non-integral citations to give examples of studies on the pronunciation of TH, T versus F, I think versus I think.
So these are examples, they're not as important as the models or the main mileposts that led to this study. So there's much more that we could say about writing, far more than we could put in one video. I teach a whole semester-long course on writing. So hopefully this will help you get started, but again, it's only the beginning, and there's a lot of resources available to help you take further steps.
Of course, you learn writing by writing.